They know what happens after a real fast and they fear it. Because the moment your spirit becomes stronger, something in the darkness begins to move. Why do attacks suddenly increase 3 days after breakthrough prayer? Why do strange dreams, heavy exhaustion, confusion, and sudden warfare appear right after spiritual victory? An ancient voice from the occult world once revealed a terrifying secret. The enemy does not panic during your fast, it prepares for what comes after it. Tonight you are about to uncover the attack they hoped you would never recognize. The ancient woman sat in silence before she finally spoke. Her hands were trembling, not from fear of people, fear of judgment. She had spent decades inside dark spiritual systems most people believe only exist in movies. Rituals, night invocations, monitoring spirits, altars built on human weakness. She claimed she had seen pastors collapse after powerful revivals, families break apart after seasons of prayer. Strong. Believers suddenly lose focus after fasting with fire and conviction. But one statement changed everything. She said the kingdom of darkness studies patterns. And according to her, one of the most vulnerable moments in a believer's life arrives 3 days after a serious fast, not during it, after it. That is the moment many people lower their spiritual guard. That is the moment many believers think the battle is over. And that is exactly when hidden attacks begin. You must understand this. Fasting weakens the flesh. It sharpens spiritual sensitivity. It increases discernment. It breaks spiritual resistance. But fasting also disrupts dark systems that were operating quietly around your life. The moment you begin denying your flesh, something changes in the spirit. Chains begin cracking. Oppression begins weakening. Spiritual pollution begins lifting. And the enemy notices immediately. But here is the dangerous part. Many believers expect warfare during the fast itself. They prepare for temptation. They prepare for hunger. They prepare for distraction. But they do not prepare for delayed retaliation. That is where many are ambushed. 3 days later, they suddenly feel exhausted, confused, emotionally unstable, unmotivated, heavy, drained. And because the fast already ended, they fail to connect the attack to the spiritual breakthrough they triggered earlier. That is how spiritual momentum gets stolen. The ancient woman explained that dark powers often wait for moments when believers become spiritually relaxed, moments when discipline fades, moments when prayer decreases, moments when spiritual excitement turns into emotional carelessness. That is why some people feel powerful during the fast, but strangely defeated afterward. The enemy studies recovery periods. The enemy watches transition moments. The enemy waits for spiritual negligence. And one of the most dangerous mistakes you can make is believing one breakthrough prayer ended the war completely. Number. Battles intensify after progress begins. You have seen this pattern before. You finally prayed consistently, then confusion entered your home. You finally completed a deep fast, then strange dreams started appearing. You finally broke an addiction, then overwhelming temptation returned stronger than before. You finally regained peace, then sudden emotional heaviness attacked your mind without warning. That is not coincidence, that is resistance. Because darkness does not surrender territory quietly. And many believers are losing battles simply because they do not recognize timing. The woman revealed something else that was deeply disturbing. She claimed the cult groups sometimes monitor spiritually active believers after major periods of consecration. Not because they fear religion, because they fear spiritual authority. There is a difference. Religious performance does not threaten darkness, but genuine spiritual awakening does. When your prayer life becomes consistent, darkness notices. When your discernment sharpens, darkness notices. When your spiritual authority increases, darkness notices. When generational cycles begin breaking, darkness notices. That is why attacks often intensify around transformation. Not because you are weak, because something is changing. Think about Elijah. After calling down fire from heaven, he suddenly collapsed emotionally under fear and exhaustion. Think about Jesus in the wilderness. The temptation intensified after prolonged fasting. Think about Daniel. The answer was released, but resistance fought against manifestation. Scripture repeatedly shows a terrifying truth many people ignore. Spiritual victories are often followed by spiritual resistance. And if you do not stay spiritually alert after breakthrough moments, you can become vulnerable to discouragement, deception, isolation, and emotional collapse. This is why so many people misunderstand spiritual warfare. They expect demons to appear dramatically, but many attacks are subtle, a sudden offense, a wave of hopelessness, a strange argument, mental fog, loss of spiritual hunger, unexpected temptation, isolation from godly voices, weariness during prayer. These attacks are designed for one purpose: to disconnect you from the momentum you gained during fasting. Because the enemy knows something many believers forget. Momentum matters, consistency matters, spiritual focus matters. And if your fire dies immediately after fasting, the breakthrough often weakens before it fully manifests. That is why the 3-day period becomes critical. The ancient woman described it as a monitoring window, a period where the enemy looks for open doors, complaining, pride, spiritual laziness, bitterness, distraction, compromise. And this is exactly where many believers unknowingly cooperate with the attack. They stop praying because they already fasted. They stop guarding their thoughts because they already broke through. They stop resisting distractions because they already sacrificed. But fasting is not the finish line, it is preparation. The real battle often begins when the fast ends. And this is why you must protect your atmosphere immediately after intense spiritual encounters. Be careful what enters your eyes. Be careful what enters your ears. Be careful who speaks into your spirit. One careless conversation can drain conviction. One toxic environment can weaken discernment. One compromise can reopen doors you just fought to close. The woman admitted many occult practitioners specifically waited for moments when believers became emotionally unstable after spiritual exhaustion. Why? Because exhaustion weakens resistance. A tired mind becomes vulnerable. A spiritually careless believer becomes easier to influence. That is why rest without prayer becomes dangerous. Silence without discernment becomes dangerous. Isolation without wisdom becomes dangerous. And this is exactly why some believers suddenly fall after powerful spiritual seasons, not because God abandoned them, because they stopped guarding what God gave them. You cannot afford to become spiritually careless after fasting. Not now. Not in this season. The attacks may come through people, through dreams, through temptation, through fear, through discouragement, through mental oppression, through unexpected conflict. But your response determines everything. You must remain alert. You must remain prayerful. You must remain spiritually disciplined. The enemy is hoping your exhaustion becomes surrender, but it will not. Not this time. The woman said something before the interview ended that shook everyone listening. She looked directly into the camera and said, "The most dangerous believer to the kingdom of darkness is not the one who fasts once with passion. It is the one who stays spiritually watchful after the fast is over." And that is the revelation many people were never taught. The second revelation was even darker, because the ancient woman claimed the attack that comes after fasting is rarely physical at first. It begins in the mind, quietly, slowly, strategically. She said darkness understands something many believers ignore. If your thoughts collapse, your discipline follows. If your focus breaks, your authority weakens. If your mind becomes polluted, your spiritual sensitivity begins to fade. That is why the enemy often targets your thoughts immediately after consecration, especially after deep fasting, especially after breakthrough prayer, especially after spiritual clarity, because fasting clears spiritual noise. And once clarity comes, the enemy rushes to corrupt it before it becomes permanent. Have you noticed this pattern? Right after powerful prayer, strange thoughts suddenly appear: condemnation, fear, lust, anger, hopelessness, doubt, thoughts that seem louder than normal, thoughts that feel invasive, thoughts that almost do not feel like your own. Many believers panic at that moment. They think the thoughts mean they failed spiritually. Number, the attack is happening because something inside you became spiritually stronger. The woman explained that occult systems often depend on mental agreement. Fear opens doors. Bitterness opens doors. Obsession opens doors. Despair opens doors. And after fasting, the enemy desperately tries to pull believers back into agreement with darkness through emotional instability. That is why many attacks begin with one sudden emotional shift: a heavy feeling, an unexplained sadness, a wave of irritation, a strange pressure, an overwhelming urge to isolate. Then comes confusion, then distraction, then spiritual numbness. And many people never realize the progression. The enemy rarely destroys people instantly. He drains them gradually, one thought at a time, one compromise at a time, one distraction at a time. The ancient woman described it as spiritual contamination. She said when believers finish fasting but stop protecting their minds, it becomes easier for dark influences to reintroduce spiritual pollution. That is why some people finish a powerful fast, then immediately return to toxic entertainment, corrupt conversations, endless scrolling, sexual compromise, gossip, fear driven content, and within days their spiritual sensitivity disappears again. Not because fasting failed, because the atmosphere around them changed. You cannot spend days purifying your spirit, then reconnect yourself to darkness without consequences. That is why guarding your mind after fasting is not optional. It is survival. The woman admitted something disturbing. She claimed many occult practitioners avoid spiritually disciplined believers because focused minds are difficult to manipulate. Think about that carefully. A focused believer is dangerous. A prayerful believer is dangerous. A disciplined believer is dangerous. A believer who controls their thoughts becomes difficult to spiritually oppress. That is why distraction has become one of the enemy's greatest weapons. Constant noise, constant entertainment, constant emotional overload, constant comparison, constant temptation. Because a distracted believer becomes spiritually weak without even noticing it. And after fasting, the enemy wants your attention scattered immediately. Why? Because focus produces power. The moment Peter looked away from Jesus, he began sinking. The moment Eve entertained deception, corruption entered. The moment Judas allowed darkness to grow unchecked, in his mind betrayal followed. Battles are often lost internally before they appear externally. And if you do not guard your mind after fasting, the enemy will attempt to slowly rebuild the strongholds your consecration weakened. That is why some people feel spiritually alive during the fast, but spiritually dry 1 week later. Not because God left them, because spiritual maintenance stopped. The ancient woman described 3 major mental attacks that often arrive after fasting. The first is condemnation. Suddenly, past failures replay in your mind, past sins, past mistakes, past shame. The enemy wants you feeling unworthy of the breakthrough God is bringing. Because condemned people stop praying boldly. The second attack is confusion. You suddenly question what God showed you clearly during fasting. Direction becomes blurry. Faith becomes unstable. Discernment weakens. Why? Because confusion interrupts obedience. And delayed obedience often destroys momentum. The third attack is discouragement. This one is deadly. Because discouragement slowly drains spiritual endurance. You begin thinking, nothing changed. Maybe my prayers were pointless. Maybe breakthrough is never coming. That is exactly what darkness wants. Because hopeless believers stop fighting. But you must understand this clearly. Delay does not mean denial. Resistance does not mean failure. And spiritual warfare after fasting does not mean your fast was ineffective. Sometimes intensified warfare is proof. Something actually shifted. The woman recalled witnessing people in occult systems panic whenever spiritually disciplined believers refused emotional collapse after fasting. Why? Because resilience breaks cycles. Consistency destroys resistance. Persistent prayer weakens dark influence over time. Darkness expects believers to quit. Darkness expects believers to become offended. Darkness expects believers to become spiritually exhausted. Darkness expects believers to stop praying after disappointment. But when you continue standing, something powerful happens. Your authority matures, your discernment sharpens, your endurance grows. And eventually, what once intimidated you loses power completely. That is why Scripture repeatedly commands believers to guard the mind, not casually, aggressively. Because what controls your thoughts eventually influences your actions. And many people lose spiritual battles before they ever speak a word. You must become intentional after fasting. Protect your atmosphere. Protect your peace. Protect your focus. Protect your spiritual habits. Do not immediately abandon prayer because the fast ended. Do not stop reading scripture because the emotional intensity faded. Do not disconnect from godly discipline because you feel temporarily strong. That is how spiritual carelessness begins. The ancient woman finally revealed why the third day mattered so much in many attacks. She claimed it was connected to spiritual fatigue. By the third day, after fasting, many believers become mentally relaxed. The urgency fades, the watchfulness fades, the discipline weakens, and that is when distraction enters unnoticed. Not always through dramatic evil, sometimes through comfort. Comfort becomes compromise. Compromise becomes distance. Distance becomes vulnerability. And vulnerability becomes attack. That is why you cannot afford spiritual sleep after breakthrough moments. You must remain awake internally. You must remain discerning. You must remain disciplined. Because the enemy does not fear emotional Christianity. He fears spiritually alert believers who refuse to surrender their minds after consecration. And maybe that is exactly why the attacks increased after your fast. Not because you lost spiritually, but because something inside you became harder to control. The third revelation was the most chilling of all, because the ancient woman claimed many believers are attacked after fasting through the people closest to them. Not strangers, not enemies, familiar voices, trusted relationships, unexpected conflict. She said darkness understands a painful truth. If the enemy cannot stop your consecration directly, he will attempt to corrupt your environment afterward. That is why some people experience sudden chaos immediately after spiritual breakthrough. Arguments appear from nowhere, misunderstandings intensify, temptations return through familiar connections, old relationships suddenly reappear, unexpected offenses begin piling up, and the timing feels almost unnatural. That is because spiritual warfare often targets atmosphere before it targets destiny. The enemy knows your environment influences your focus, your conversations influence your thoughts, your relationships influence your endurance. And if your atmosphere becomes toxic after fasting, your spiritual clarity can slowly become contaminated. The woman described how occult systems frequently exploited emotional reactions, anger, offense, fear, emotional instability. Because once emotions become uncontrolled, discernment weakens rapidly. That is why many believers lose peace after breakthrough, not because the breakthrough disappeared, because emotional warfare entered the environment around them. You have probably seen this yourself. You complete a serious fast. You feel close to God, focused, peaceful, strong. Then suddenly someone provokes you, someone insults you, someone betrays you, someone disappoints you. And within moments, your peace begins collapsing. The enemy understands that emotional reactions can reopen doors fasting helped close. That is why self-control becomes critical after consecration. One uncontrolled emotional moment can damage days of spiritual discipline. The ancient woman revealed something deeply unsettling. She claimed dark spiritual systems sometimes watch for wounded believers more than weak believers. Because wounded people are easier to manipulate emotionally. Think about that, eh? Hurt believer who refuses healing becomes vulnerable to bitterness. A betrayed believer becomes vulnerable to distrust. A discouraged believer becomes vulnerable to isolation. And isolation is one of the enemy's favorite weapons after fasting. Because isolated believers stop receiving correction. They stop receiving encouragement. They stop receiving spiritual covering. Then slowly the mind becomes vulnerable to deception. This is exactly why Elijah isolated himself after victory. And once isolation began, fear consumed him. The enemy always tries to separate people before spiritually attacking them deeply. Separate them from wise voices, separate them from accountability, separate them from prayer, separate them from truth. Because isolation amplifies internal warfare. The woman said something many people desperately need to hear. Not every attack after fasting comes through demons. Some attacks come through relationships that pull you away from spiritual discipline, relationships that normalize compromise, relationships that constantly drain your peace, relationships that mock conviction, relationships that feed emotional instability. And many believers ignore these dangers because the people involved feel familiar. But familiar does not always mean safe. You must discern what affects your spirit after fasting. Some environments weaken discernment immediately. Some conversations release confusion immediately. Some people consistently drain spiritual focus. Every time they appear, pay attention to patterns. The enemy often hides behind repetition, repeated temptation, repeated discouragement, repeated emotional chaos, repeated compromise, repeated distractions. Patterns reveal spiritual pressure points. And if you do not recognize them, cycles continue repeating for years. The woman explained that darkness frequently studies emotional triggers. What makes you angry? What makes you afraid? What makes you insecure? What makes you lonely? Do you react impulsively? Because targeted attacks often arrive through unresolved weaknesses. That is why fasting alone is not enough. You also need healing. Deliverance without healing creates vulnerable people. Consecration without emotional maturity creates unstable people. Spiritual power without self-control creates dangerous vulnerability. The enemy does not only fear prayer, he fears transformed character. Because a believer who learns emotional discipline becomes far harder to manipulate. This is why scripture constantly emphasizes guarding the heart. Because whatever controls your heart eventually controls your decisions. And many people lose spiritual momentum because they allow emotional chaos to dominate their reactions after breakthrough. The ancient woman recalled witnessing believers experience major spiritual victories, only to fall into unnecessary warfare through offense. One argument destroyed their focus, one betrayal destroyed their peace, one disappointment destroyed their motivation, and darkness celebrated every moment of emotional collapse. Why? Because emotionally unstable believers struggle to maintain spiritual consistency. This is exactly why the enemy tries to provoke reactions after fasting. If he can pull you into anger, you lose focus. If he can pull you into fear, you lose boldness. If he can pull you into bitterness, you lose clarity. If he can pull you into discouragement, you lose endurance. And suddenly the fire you carried during fasting begins fading. Not because God left, because your emotions became unguarded. You must become spiritually intelligent in this season. Not every battle deserves your reaction. Not every offense deserves your energy. Not every accusation deserves your attention. Some conflicts are distractions specifically designed to drain your spiritual momentum after consecration. And mature believers learn when to remain silent. The woman describes spiritually disciplined believers as difficult targets because they refused emotional manipulation. They stayed calm under pressure, prayerful under attack, focused during chaos, watchful during temptation. That consistency frustrated darkness because the enemy feeds on instability. That is why spiritual maturity matters so much after fasting. You cannot afford impulsive decisions. You cannot afford careless reactions. You cannot afford emotionally driven choices. Not after what God is building inside you. The third day attack often intensifies through emotional exhaustion. By then, your body is recovering. Your emotions are sensitive. Your mind is tired. And the enemy hopes exhaustion will produce careless reactions. That is when many believers speak destructive words, return to toxic habits, reconnect with dangerous influences, abandon discipline, and slowly drift away from the very breakthrough they fought for. But you must resist that trap. Do not allow temporary emotions to destroy permanent progress. Do not allow offense to poison your spirit. Do not allow emotional warfare to disconnect you from God's direction. Stay alert, stay prayerful, stay disciplined. And most importantly, stay guarded around your atmosphere after fasting. Because the ancient woman ended this revelation with a warning that silenced the room. She said, "Darkness does not always attack your strength directly. Sometimes it simply sends the right distraction at the right emotional moment." The final revelation carried the heaviest warning. Because the ancient woman claimed the greatest danger after fasting is not the attack itself, it is spiritual overconfidence. The moment a believer thinks they are untouchable, the enemy begins preparing another strategy. She said many people survive intense spiritual warfare, only to fall through pride, carelessness, or spiritual sleep afterward. That is why some believers experience incredible breakthroughs, then suddenly disappear spiritually. Prayer weakens, discipline fades, softens, compromise slowly returns, and eventually they become spiritually unrecognizable. Not overnight, gradually. The woman described it as spiritual erosion, a slow weakening process most people never notice until major damage already happened. And according to her, this is exactly why many attacks intensify 3 days after fasting. Because by then many believers begin relaxing internally. The urgency fades, the vigilance fades, the desperation for God decreases, and that is when hidden weaknesses begin resurfacing. You must understand something critical. The enemy does not need to destroy you instantly if he can slowly disconnect you from discipline. A prayerless believer becomes vulnerable. A distracted believer becomes vulnerable. A proud believer becomes vulnerable. And a spiritually careless believer becomes easy to influence over time. The ancient woman admitted that dark systems often depended on one dangerous assumption. Most believers do not remain spiritually consistent after breakthrough. They pray intensely during crisis, then become passive once pressure decreases. They fast for emergency breakthrough, then return to old habits afterward. They seek God desperately during warfare, then neglect intimacy once relief comes. And that inconsistency creates cycles. That is why some people keep repeating the same battles year after year. Temporary discipline cannot sustain permanent victory. You need lasting spiritual habits, lasting discernment, watchfulness. The woman revealed something deeply unsettling. She claimed some attacks after fasting are specifically designed to lure believers back into old patterns, old addictions, old relationships, old mental strongholds, old emotional wounds, because darkness always attempts to reclaim territory it lost. And if believers stop resisting after fasting, the cycle quietly restarts. That is why many people feel an intense pull toward compromise right after major spiritual breakthroughs. Suddenly, temptations increase. Old cravings return. Old thoughts resurface. Old desires awaken again. The enemy wants you to believe nothing actually changed. But that is a lie. Resistance often increases precisely because transformation began. This is why Jesus warned his disciples to watch and pray, not occasionally, continually, because spiritual sleep creates vulnerability. The ancient woman said one of the most feared believers in occult systems was the believer who maintained discipline after emotional intensity faded. Think about that carefully. Anyone can pray powerfully during emotional moments. Anyone can fast during desperation. Anyone can seek God during crisis. But remaining spiritually consistent after breakthrough, that requires maturity, that requires endurance, that requires genuine transformation. And darkness fears disciplined believers because consistent spiritual habits slowly destroy long standing strongholds. The woman recalled witnessing people become spiritually dangerous after learning how to remain watchful beyond emotional seasons. These believers stopped depending on feelings. They prayed even when tired, worshipped even when discouraged, stayed disciplined even when attacked, maintained peace even during pressure. And eventually, the enemy lost influence over areas that once controlled them completely. That is the level of spiritual maturity many believers never reach. Because too many people chase moments instead of transformation. They want emotional experiences, visible signs, temporary excitement. But real spiritual authority is built through consistency, quiet obedience, private discipline, persistent prayer, daily surrender. And the enemy knows that if you truly become consistent, your entire life can change permanently. That is why the attack after fasting often focuses on interruption. Interrupt the prayer life, interrupt the focus, interrupt the peace, interrupt the discipline, interrupt the consistency. Interrupted growth produces unstable believers, and unstable believers struggle to maintain victory. The ancient woman described spiritual watchfulness as a form of protection many believers underestimate. She said spiritually alert people notice attacks early. They recognize unhealthy patterns quickly. They discern toxic environments faster. They resist compromise before it grows stronger. And that awareness makes them difficult to spiritually trap. But careless believers ignore warning signs. They entertain dangerous influences, excuse repeated compromise, ignore spiritual fatigue, and eventually small weaknesses become large openings. This is why you must remain spiritually awake after fasting. Not fearful, awake, there is a difference. Fear weakens discernment, but spiritual alertness strengthens it. Do not become obsessed with darkness. Become committed to discipline. Become committed to prayer. Become committed to guarding your atmosphere. Become committed to obedience. Your consistency is terrifying to the enemy. The woman finally revealed the true purpose behind many delayed attacks after fasting. Not merely destruction, distraction. If the enemy can distract you long enough, you eventually lose momentum. If momentum disappears, discipline weakens. If discipline weakens, compromise grows. And if compromise grows unchecked, strongholds slowly rebuild. That is the strategy. Not always immediate collapse, slow spiritual drift. And many believers never realize it. It's happening until they feel far from God again. That is why you cannot afford spiritual passivity after breakthrough. You fought too hard for freedom. You prayed too hard for clarity. You fasted too hard for transformation. Do not surrender your progress through carelessness now. The woman's final words carried terrifying weight. She stared into the camera and said, most believers prepare for attack during the fast, but the wise ones prepare for the attack that comes after the victory. And suddenly everything made sense. The strange heaviness, the unexpected temptations, the emotional warfare, the sudden distractions, the exhaustion, the confusion, the resistance. It was never random. It was retaliation against spiritual progress. But now you see the strategy clearly. And once a believer recognizes the strategy, the attack loses its power to surprise them. Now you understand why the battle intensified after your fast. Not because you were abandoned, but because your spirit became dangerous to darkness. The enemy hoped exhaustion would silence you. He hoped distraction would weaken you. He hoped pressure would pull you back into spiritual sleep. But you are still standing. And this time you will not lose your fire after breakthrough. You will stay watchful, disciplined, prayerful, and spiritually armed, because what God started in you will not be reversed.